Hi everyone, welcome back. It's been a while. I've been a bit busy with work, and then I've also been a bit busy testing for Eternal Weekend, which was last weekend. I played in the Friday event and had a really fun time. I was playing four color control. It's the same deck that if you watch Brian Koval, he took the same deck, played it to a 12th place finish on the Sunday event, so that was really cool. I am doing a similar thing here where I'm going to review some of the matches I played. I'm not going through every single one. I'm just going to pick a few of them that I felt highlighted some of the strengths of the deck, but also just some of the uh, you know play mistakes that I made and could have done better at. So a mix of both. I think it's important when previewing something new to not just show like the plus sides of the deck doing well. You also got to focus on some things you could improve and sometimes where the deck maybe could have done better or you as a player could have done better. So I'm going over three matches. First one was round two of the event. I'm playing against Wonder Pro. I took some time to record the replays from Magic Online, and then I will be stepping through that recording now. Wonder Pro is known for playing Doomsday, so this hand is obviously good against that strategy, having the endurances in the opener, but one endurance is definitely not enough. The opponent is confirmed to be on Doomsday, given the personal tutor, and that's what they find. The Wasteland could be a good draw potentially in the future. If they're not expecting it, it can certainly mess with some of their piles. I don't have any way to fight over this Doomsday, so letting it resolve, I have no options. The fight's going to be, when they make the ending pile to see if the endurances resolve. I look through my opponent's exile after they make their pile, and I saw that all four Force of Wills were gone, and only 3 dazes were gone. So playing around days definitely weighs on my mind over the course of the next few turns. And basically, what I wanted to do is I wanted to have enough where I could hard cast one endurance and pitch cast another endurance, so that if one got dazed, I still had the other one in play. So that's why you didn't see me like play the Uro and then like put Karakas into play and return Uro to my hand. It's because I wanted to have both endurances available for the next turn. Opponent does run out a wastable source of mana, and I choose that to wasteland them. Kind of the idea being that they might not have suspected this card in my deck, and so it could certainly mess with some of the piles that they are making. It might buy me extra time to find like a Force of Will or another green card for the endurance, things of this nature. My opponent goes and fetches, plays a Thoughtseize, sees the endurance, takes one of them. I fetch to thin. I have a fetch land if I draw Brainstorm, so it doesn't really matter. See a Ponder. I ponder, see Brainstorm, Sword of Swords. I decide to shuffle that, and it draws a land. And then here's where I make, I think, my first big mistake of the match, where my opponent casts the Thassa's Oracle, and they only have one card in library. So I think what I'm supposed to do here is use the Swords to Plowshares first, because if they don't have a 0-mana cycler in their hand, then I don't need to evoke the endurance. I can just let the trigger resolve, and they have 0 devotion, and they have one card in library, so they don't win the game. And then that kind of converts a really bad card, Swords to Plowshares, into an actually useful card in this situation. So that was a big mistake on my part. I'm not sure if it would have affected the outcome of the match, because my opponent has 2 oracles in their list. They made a double oracle pile, but having this endurance to fight over the second oracle would have been great. And obviously, of course, if the swords resolved, that would have been good too. I decided to put Ponder back on top of my library just because my opponent has to have a second oracle or they can't win the game. And if they have a second oracle, I want to find counter magic. I did find a Force of Will. Unfortunately, no blue cards to pitch, and I do note about the days, so it makes my lines kind of awkward where top 2 cards in my library were mana sources, but I did want to wasteland the opponent. And there ends up I choose to swords. Extra is a land as well, which is again slightly unfortunate. My opponent goes out and plays the Oracle. You have a Force of Will for it. I was expecting a Pact of Negation here. I did see one in exile, but sometimes 2 is possible. Opponent is playing a Misdirection in their deck, kind of as Force of Will number 5, which does the job just as well here. And the Oracle wins. So it's hard to know if they had a 0 mana Cycler still in their hand, and if my decision mattered, but definitely using the swords on the first Oracle would have been much, much better than leading on the Endurance there. That being said, going to game 2, we're on the play. Decided to keep this hand. It has cantrips, it has some interaction. Witherbloom Command can target the opponent and potentially mess with their pile by making them mill 3, which is something that they might not be expecting. I think I make my other big mistake of the match here, where I choose to cast Raven's Crime on turn 1 instead of Ponder. And the issue with this is that with 7 cards in the opening hand, Raven's Crime is just not... It's not like useful interaction right now, because the card you're taking from their hand isn't going to matter on turn 1. So my thought process going in was that, okay, I want to start interacting with my opponent as early as possible, so I'm going to cast this Raven's Crime and not cast the Ponder. The problem is, like I said, it doesn't actually stop them in a meaningful way. It doesn't interact with them in a meaningful way until they are much lower on cards in hand and the cards left in their hand are all useful. If they have a good hand here, turn 1, Dark Ritual, Doomsday, Raven's Crime isn't going to protect me from that. So what I really need to be doing is pondering for interaction. And then save Raven's Crime for like a turn 3 or turn 4 play, where it's getting something useful out of their hand, or I can do it more than once in one turn. I draw a second Witherbloom Command. I decide that I think my best line is to hope that I got something out of them here. They had the Force of Will to protect them. So, obviously, strong hand from my opponent's side of the field, where they had turn 1 Dark Ritual Doomsday with Force of Will protection. However, I think that, given that they forced the Witherbloom Command, it looks like the Oracle might have been, 3 cards down. And so if I had pondered on turn 1 and found like an Endurance or a Force of Will or this sort of effect, then I might have actually been able to win this game. As strong as my opponent's draw was, I think I could have had a strong enough draw there. So, again, obviously Ponder's not guaranteed to find something useful there, but it would have been a better line to take and would have given me a better shot to win the game. So Doomsday, I think, is a very close matchup for this deck. Obviously, you have a lot of tools, but they also have a lot of tools. And I think that, playing well is an important part of that matchup. So it's nice to go over your games sometimes and see where you could have made some improvements there. That round that we just went over was round 2 in my event. I was 1-1. In round 3, I defeated Death and Taxes to become 2-1. And then this is round 4, where my opponent ends up playing a Jeskai Ragavan variant. Obviously, I don't know what my opponent is on. This opening hand seems reasonable to keep. It has lands, it has decent spells, it has Brainstorm. Obviously, on the draw against an aggressive strategy, it's not ideal to not have any of your removal spells in your hand, but that does sometimes happen. My opponent dashes a Ragavan, and I decide that I want to Brainstorm here to make sure it doesn't steal anything good. I have a few options here. The Swords is a great pickup. I decide to put 2 lands back, and then it's kind of annoying that I have to either draw the Mystic Sanctuary or part ways with it, but I decide that exiling the Mystic Sanctuary, just because it's so far away from being active, especially in the face of the Wasteland, it's better to just have as many lands that enter play untapped at my disposal. So my opponent exiles the Sanctuary. They ponder. They bin a Murktide. Leaves me thinking that maybe they already have one. They certainly don't have another color source of mana because they wouldn't have played the Wasteland if they did. I decide here to leave up Swords rather than play the Baleful Strix just because it's a little bit worse against Daze and it's a little bit worse against removal. And I know that I can play the Swords through a Daze, or at the very least, the opponent can't Wasteland me and dash Ragavan without another mana source. Actually, I want to go back real quick because this is something I just realized. So here, what my opponent should do is they should have a stop in their draw step, because what they had the option to do was Wasteland my Underground Sea in their draw step, and then I float the mana and then it fades, and then they can dash the Ragavan, and then if they have a Daze, they can Daze my Swords to Plowshares. So that is one thing to keep in mind as like a Wasteland player, is that sometimes you do want to put the stop in your draw step because you're not sure if you want to Wasteland, but you also don't want them to float the mana during your main phase. So here, if they had a Daze, they could have dashed and dazed my Swords to Plowshares. In this case, they have Force Pitch Force. I decided to Brainstorm, potentially to find a Force Will, but also just to stack, put a land on top of my library or something that Ragavan can't steal this turn. I think this is one thing that is a good tip to get in the habit of, is when Force of Will is on the stack, especially if you're tapping out for like Brainstorm or some other instant, it's much more likely that your Brainstorm is going to resolve from your opponent's point of view, because, say they have a Daze in hand, they would much prefer to Daze like a Force of Will if you find that. So even though it's not really my plan to look for a Force and force their Force, I still want to Brainstorm while the Force is on the stack, because from my opponent's point of view, they would want the Brainstorm to resolve, So it just makes the Brainstorm more likely to resolve, whereas the alternative would be like, okay, the Force resolves inside of combat, I'm in a Brainstorm. Well, now they know the Ragavan's in play, they know it's attacking, they're like, oh, okay, I can just Daze this Brainstorm. So I think this is a much better time to use it. Again, I put 2 lands on top because I think these spells are useful. Loam can get back extra lands later. And now I have double white mana, so I can Ending and Swords in 1 turn cycle. This is what I decided to do. It kind of sucks that I have to get Savannah here. It also sucks that they have to draw a second Wasteland. That's okay. This turn they decided to play Murktide and Rag instead of dashing Rag, which I think is reasonable from their point of view. And then here I'm behind the 8 ball too much. I can't play around Daze. They only have 1 card in hand anyway. Luckily it's not Daze, and I get to Swords the Murktide and use the Baleful Strix. Witherbloom Command is obviously a good pickup if they somehow get through the Strix, which they do with the Prismatic Ending. But now I can kill this Rag and then rebuy a land. Nice little 2-for-1 there. My opponent exiles Force Will, which they can't cast, so I'm nice there to get a miss. I decided to fetch now. I think because I want to hold up blue-white. Can't remember exactly why. Because I literally couldn't cast Witherbloom Command without fetching it, right? That's the reason. I could have Flusterstorm this to tap my opponent out, and that's better against like a dash drag. I decided to not do that just because it's still like a 0-for-1 in a sense. You're using a 0-for-1 for tempo, and I kind of felt that that's not what I wanted to be doing at that point in the game. Hero coming down is great. I could cast Loam here and get back lands, but I decided, again, to hold up the Flusterstorm. My opponent draws something like Expressive Iteration. It's a card I would want to Flusterstorm, as an example. They do hit Brainstorm, unfortunately. And then it's a turn. I escape Uro, and it resolves. Here I make a play where I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. So I fetch in response to this Uro trigger, because I don't want to draw. There's only 1 more fetchable land in the deck, and I don't want to draw it. However, my opponent has Swords to Plowshares, and now that there's, I have access to 1 less mana source, it lets them use both of their treasures and Daze the Swords. And I left myself open to this, but even looking at it in the aftermath, I can't necessarily say that it's too bad for me, I got rid of all the treasure tokens, which has value, and it was still, a 2-for-0 when everything is said and done, because at the end of the day, you're swordsing an Uro. that came back from the graveyard, which wasn't a card in my hand. So it's hard for me to say that like it was bad, even though like it was maybe an option I shouldn't have let my opponent have access to. Going back, I think I would still do it. Obviously, I can't know the cards in my opponent's hand, so I don't mind it really. Anyway, my opponent's Ragavan hits a Ponder. I decided to get some lands back first. Here I have options. I could have just dredged the Loam and put Uro into the graveyard and escaped it, but I figured that I have so much mana, and next turn I will be able to play and escape Uro while playing around Daze. So I felt like that was a slightly better line to just draw the Uro. Because the front half of Uro does still have value. It's still 3 life in a card, you know. Opponent casts Expressive Iteration. They need to find land plus a way to kill this Baleful Strix. They don't. I decide to hit the rag there. Because they exile Brainstorm to the Expressive. If they don't have a land in hand, they can't cast it, so it's really important to deny them the treasure token. At this point, I play and escape Uro, like I talked about previously. And my opponent decides to cast Force of Will. And here I have a decision, obviously, where I could force back and put the Uro in play, or I could let this resolve and just go for Uro next turn. I felt that at 13 life, it's really hard for my opponent to kill me. You know, they only have 2 mana in play, they have 1 card in hand. And so I just felt that if I let their force resolve, if you look at like the game state after that happens, I'm in an incredibly winning position. I just feel like I'm so likely to win the game with Uro in graveyard, force blue card in hand. And so I felt like it was fine to let this resolve. If you look at the game state after it resolves, it's very favorable for me. Whereas if I force back, then I'm kind of, you know, out of resources potentially, and could lose to something unexpected, like a Swords of Plowshares into Marquette Region or things of this nature. So I felt like keeping the forces was a slightly safer play. So that's what I do. I let their force resolve. Say, okay, I can just go again next turn. I have no more fetchables in the deck, so I'm just leaving the fetch lands in my hand. Or maybe like Brainstorms into like Dredging Loam next turn. Things of this nature. They cast another Expressive. Now they only have 1 card in hand. This one I do decide to force. There's something they can do to stop my Uro. And with the dress down, like the scariest thing would probably be Murktide Regent, for example. And I can just dress down to turn that into a 3/3. Swords, of course, is a good pickup. I do decide to Brainstorm here with the goal of putting the 2 fetch lands back into the library and then Dredging Loam next turn. The endurances are nice as well. So I could choose to force this. I do choose to force it this time. With only 1 card in hand, I'm just not scared of anything anymore. And with 19 cards in deck, I do actually need to start ending the game. Obviously, Endurance can shuffle my own graveyard into my library if I really need to buy me some more time. But I just decided that with 1 card in hand, I wasn't scared of anything, and the 6/6 can stay in play. Here they reveal to me the last card is not Daze, so I feel perfectly comfortable playing out the Endurance. And then I choose to hit their graveyard. Just, you know, if they draw a Marquette Region, it's nice to give that some pause. And because I have the second Endurance for my graveyard, I'm not worried about it. So yeah, that was game 1. Little close for comfort, you know. Obviously, in the early game, we were behind the 8 ball a bit between the Ragavan and the Wasteland. But between our chief removal spells and our card advantage, we were able to pull ahead from that and eventually push into the lead. So we're going into game 2. Again, not ideal on the draw, but you know me, I never mulligan. And I think it's fine to keep this sort of hand just because we have these 2-for-1s in our hand that, even though we're on the draw, will get value as long as we can survive. Carpet is a great pickup here. I decide that playing it into Daze is worth it. My hand is kind of slow. It's a bit on the slow side. So if they want to, you know, set themselves back on turn 1 to deal with the Carpet, that's fine with me. It lets me play out, you know, a Strix and Witherbloom in a much more, you know, like case where it's likely to resolve. So here I could go for Strix while their Pyroblast is down, or I could cast the Witherbloom Command. The window on command is running thin, where my opponent just needs one more card type to get Delirium. So I decide that that is the better card to cast. Kill their guy, mill 3. Karakas is a nice hit. I knew it was there from the Ponder, but obviously it's nice against Ragavan specifically. They need Wasteland plus Dash Rag to be able to really do anything about that. They have Murktide instead. Obviously not ideal. They left up red mana, which leads me thinking that they have Pyroblast in hand, but obviously I have Hydroblast. I Brainstorm first to potentially try and bait out the Pyroblast. But if they don't, I just put back 2 lands and fetch. Cast the Baleful Strix. They make a small misclick here, where they let the Strix resolve and then went to Pyroblast it. However, it ended up working out the exact same way, where I would have just countered it on the stack, so no harm, no foul. Here we're sweating things like removal spells for the Strix, plus us not finding removal for the Murktide. They do hit swords off the Expressive. They get to attack down to 15. Luckily, we have a bit of a life total buffer here. And if we find things like Uro, that's obviously really good. I decided to lead with blue. Want to Brainstorm first. Put some excess lands back. Cast Ponder. Uro is really good here, obviously. I decide to Loam first. I wanted to play around Surgical Extraction a bit. It's a card that is fairly common in the Delver decks. And so my thought process was, okay, I will get the Mystical Dispute this turn, and then if anything bad happens, I can counter it, hopefully. And then next turn, I can, with the Carpet mana, play and escape Uro. Potentially with Mystical Dispute back up, potentially not. But that was my plan. I felt that was better than playing the Uro this turn and exposing it to Surgical. And also, I didn't want to use the Karakas to return it to my hand, because that leaves me open to a Ragavan attack. Unfortunately, my opponent has Prismatic Ending for the Carpet, which means my life definitely just got a good deal harder. Uro is much farther away from being escaped, certainly all in one turn. I decided to counter this with Mystical Dispute, because it's 2 for 1. My opponent had a bit of a timing tell there, where they paused a bit before they let the dispute resolve, and to me that kind of implies that they have a Red Blast in hand. That's something that when you play enough, you kind of get a sense for, is like, oh, like they spent like 3 or 4 seconds thinking about this. They're probably thinking about countering it. Whereas if they let it resolve instantly, it's, they just didn't have anything. So here I'm trying to play around Pyroblast as best I can, deciding what to do with my lines. Still don't find a swords or a Run Afoul. Sorry. This was a small misstep here. I should have put Ending on top of my library with Brainstorm and left the land in hand. I believe I had not played a land for turn, and so I would have been able to play that even if the Uro got countered. But our life total is getting pretty low here. We're down to 6. If we have to fetch, the Murktide is lethal next turn. And this True Name Nemesis coming down, we were not expecting this card. We cut all our Dress Downs, unfortunately. So this is an interesting Brainstorm. We're at 5. We have this True Name bearing us down. We have this Murktide Regent in the air that's presenting lethal. And we don't have an answer to either of them right now, except for maybe Teferi. But we also believe our opponent to have Pyroblast in hand. So it's really interesting on how I want to stack this. I think the ending is doing the least amount of good here. And then, I'm just going to draw whatever else I put back underneath that, which was the Raven's Crime. I do decide to dredge Loam because drawing the crime in hand is basically the same thing as having crime in graveyard, and Loam could potentially find us stuff. Plus, I know Ending and crime don't really help me in the situation, and I'm going to cast Ponder, so I just want to get those 2 cards off the top of my library to hopefully find better things with the Ponder, which I would certainly qualify these cards as. So Wasteland plus Swords to Plowshares is pretty much exactly what we're looking for here, where we can choose to draw the swords and kill the Murktide and then play Teferi, Teferi plus swords. So we have 2 answers for Murktide Regent, or we could draw the Wasteland and waste them off red this turn, and then escape Uro, and then draw the swords. We decided to go for the latter line because, like I said, I have read my opponent for having Pyroblast in hand. Just the way they've tapped their mana, the way they've thought about my spells, leads me to believe that they have Pyroblast in hand and not Force Blue card. This line is much worse against Force Blue card, obviously, so it's like a bit of a risk, but we decided that it is worth it. And the play works out for us. Small misclick from the opponent. I should say big misclick. The opponent did have the Pyroblast, and they meant to target the Uro. Obviously, they targeted their land and then promptly conceded. However, I think that at this point the game is over. Just if they can't answer the Uro being escaped the next turn, we just escape it next turn. It keeps pace with the true name, and then eventually we draw our Plague Engineers and take home the game. So that was a really intense game. A lot of back and forth. It took a really long time to find an answer to Murktide. We found it just in time. And again, I think this highlights some of the strengths of the deck, where you just have so much grind and so much staying power where you can last a long time before your opponent kills you. And I think this matchup is somewhat favorable for the control deck, just versus the tempo strategies. I think Witherbloom Command is a big part of that. Just killing a thing and getting a land back is really important because it just lets you play through days, tempo out your spells, XYZ. It does so much for the deck. So I'm going into round 9. My record at this point in time was 5-3. So this was for, fighting for a min cash and also pride, I think that 6-3 is a pretty respectable record, especially in a high level event like Eternal Weekend, whereas 5-4 is just very, mediocre middle of the pack. So, fighting for some money, fighting for some pride. Let's get right into it. And this matchup is really good, so I was really happy to display it here. My opponent reveals Urion, and they are usually they end up playing Death and Taxes, so this is what I was expecting going into it. My first hand had 1 land and no cantrips, and so I decided that against a Wasteland strategy on the draw, it was just better to mulligan, find something better. This hand's a lot better. The mana I need to cast my spells, and then some good interaction, including Prismatic Ending for the Vial, which is very nice. Vial just is not anywhere near what it used to be, especially against this deck. And the no turn to play out of the opponent is a welcome relief from my point of view. It just gives me time to hit my land drops and just keep pushing forward. I am down a card because of the mulligan, so giving myself time to find my card advantage spells like Baleful Strix and Uro is really nice. I decided to play the Strix here rather than hold up Dress Down. It's not there's no guarantee that my opponent will cast something for me to counter the ability on. If they had Stoneforge Mystic or something like that, I think they would have played it. So again, no plays out of my opponent. Doing some hand reading. Feels like maybe some Swords of Plowshares are in their hand, maybe some Solitudes, maybe Flicker Wisp, maybe some extra lands, sort of these sorts of cards. I think that when your opponent doesn't do anything proactive, it's definitely a good point in time to reflect on what they might have in hand, because it can push you or help you inform your decisions going down the road, where it's like, okay, at this point in time, I feel like my opponent has some number of Solitudes, some number of Swords, and that can maybe inform my decisions down the road. Sanctum Prelate comes down. I don't want them to get to name anything, so I decide to cast the Dress Down in response. Now it's just a 3-mana 2/2. And then Endurance is a really good pickup here because it can answer this Timeless Dragon. I take my draw, I see a Ponder. Decide to cast it. See Brainstorm and 2 mana sources. I think the Brainstorm's pretty good. The mana sources aren't. That's what fetch lands are for. And I just do this now so that I don't give my opponent a window to respond. And here I decide to hold back. I think that the long game favors me, so I don't really want to be trading damage potentially. The Flicker Wisp comes down. It targets the Sanctum Prelate. Obviously the goal is to flicker it and name 1, so I decide to Swords it in response and not let that happen. And then I just equip the Shadow Spear. So here I'm in a nice spot. I just drew Force of Will, and I have the mana to cast it. So I could Brainstorm here, I could Ending here, but I think that when you have a good window to spend 5 mana on a Force of Will, it's really important that you do that. So I decided to hold up my mana here. And the Skyclave is like not the best spell to force. It's definitely a bait spell for my opponent's side of the table. But again, still just getting to use your mana when you can is important, and it's never too bad to be in that situation. So I Brainstorm in response to the port. This is my upkeep. I put back Ponder plus land and keep the Ponder. Now here I have an interesting decision. So I draw the Jace. The awkward thing here is that the Shadow Spear gives Flickerwisp trample, and so all they need to do is kill my Endurance, and they will be able to kill my Jace. So I'm really not sure if I made the correct play here of playing the Jace, where so I could play the Jace, I could tick up to see, what my opponent's top card is, and survive a Flickerwisp hit guaranteed, but that's really bad against another Skyclave Apparition, which is a card my opponent could have. Like I said from a few turns ago, I'm reading my opponent for Solitude. Solitude is just like a card that they could very easily have, same with Swords to Plowshares, and so this Jace is very risky. I think that there's a big chance that they could have a removal spell for the Endurance and then kill the Jace, but if I use the Jace in like any other way, like to bounce the Flickerwisp or to +2, then I lose the Skyclave Apparition, and both of those are likely cards my opponent could be holding, which makes it really awkward. So what I decide to do is I decide to Brainstorm and put Force of Will on top of my library with the Mystic Sanctuary, so that if there's another blue card underneath, I can force a removal spell and then keep the Jace around. So I put back Ending plus land, and I see this arrow. My opponent has the Solitude that we talked about, and this is just really awkward because it's like, okay, I could force pitching the arrow, but then if my opponent has another Solitude, I still lose the Jace, and the top 2 cards in my library are not that good. So I'm like kind of resigning myself to draw those 2 cards and not be in good shape. I think looking back, I should have just let this happen and then went to cast Arrow, Prismatic Ending the Flickerwisp, and then the next turn escape Arrow. Things of this nature. I think that losing the Arrow was just too much of a loss here, because it's very easy for my opponent to have a second Solitude. It's a 4 of in their deck, and they didn't do anything for the first 4 turns of the game. So they do have the other Solitude, and the Jace does go down. I still get to kill the Flickerwisp, which is like some consolation here. I decide to Wasteland just because it keeps them off things like Batterskull, it keeps them off things like Orion if they decide to put it in their hand and then cast it next turn. They do put it in hand. That's good. I'm drawing this extra land. So yeah, going back, I could have maybe just not forced the Solitude. I also could have maybe just not played the Jace that turn, just knowing that it's in a vulnerable spot, and maybe just decided, hey, if I don't want to lose this Jace, I can just use my turn to Ending the Flickerwisp, see what my opponent puts into play, and then next turn, potentially I can fetch for Force of Will, or I can just fetch for a Swords to Plowshares, and kill the next thing that they put into play, and then this Jace is in play, I have a Swords in hand, and I'm just not under pressure at all. So I think looking back, probably just not even playing the Jace there, and just using the Ending on the Flickerwisp would have been preferred. At this point in the game, I'm really far behind. Again, because I used the Force of Will to exile my Uro. So I'm kind of just like trying to scramble back and see how I can claw back into the game. The Stoneforge comes down and finds Kaldra. Wasteland is not a terrible pickup, all things considered. So I get to Ending the Stoneforge and waste the Karakas. So now they're down to only 4 lands, which is not quite enough to bounce and play the Batterskull. They do draw a Mother of Runes and cast it. And then this Force of Will is it's not a bad draw, but obviously I'm behind on the board. So again, when you have an opportunity to use all your mana, you should do so. I'm leaving up the Tundra. It represents the Swords of Plowshares, so the Mother of Runes does not attack. A pretty standard play from my opponent's point of view, but obviously they did still play well to make that play. Flusterstorm definitely not intended for this matchup, let's just say. It's not even fully dead, they do play things like Swords of Plowshares and stuff of this nature, but right here, obviously, it's not very, very good. My opponent here does draw their 5th mana source, and I think they make a pretty good play here. They decide to just equip the Battle Skull to Mother of Runes. They could have gone for a Orion and flickered the Battle Skull and just had 2 huge bodies in play, but it's bad against another Force of Will type effect, and this is more than enough to win the game. It lets Mother of Runes attack while still holding up its protection ability. I like this a lot from their point of view. Here I draw Teferi, which is a pretty good draw. It lets me bounce the Battle Skull, and then I play out this land. And now if Mother of Runes wants to kill the Teferi, it does have to tap itself, which obviously I know there's no good cards in my hand for that, but my opponent might not. At this point, we're looking for another Uro to hopefully fall back into things, but I think all things considered, we're pretty far behind. My opponent does play out the Battle Skull. We know about Cauldron Complete and Orion in hand, so they're just 1 mana away from casting the Cauldron. Hunter is obviously a really important draw, hopefully helping us find something good. Loam is not really what we're looking for. It's pretty much only Uro at this point that we need to see. Maybe Dress Down, potentially as well. Sword is generally reasonable, but obviously the Mother of Runes is active, so here it's not that good. My opponent does draw their 7th mana source, but they decide that casting Cauldron, they just don't need to do it. They're already really ahead on board. It stops them from making a Saga token, so they just prioritize the Saga token instead. It makes sense from my opponent's point of view. And here, unfortunately, Gustav will not help me, and then I'm dead on board to the Saga token and the Battle Skull. So just real quick. So we definitely petered out near the end there, but I do think that there were many things we could have done differently on that critical turn, where we could have either not played the Jace, or we could have not used the Force of Will, and still just kept the Uro. And I think both of those would have been preferable to the line we took. So I think that one was definitely on me. Really close game. I think up through then, it was a lot of back and forth and a lot of tight play, but then that is Magic sometimes. It's just, you can make one mistake and it can snowball out of control from there. And I just left myself with no resources left, and I knew I was drawing not ideal cards after that. So it's very late. I'm very tired. This is not round 9 of a 9-round tournament. It's 5 a.m. So I decided, all right, gotta brush myself off, just gotta focus and play as best I can going forward. So we go into game 2. I'm on the play. Another 1 lander, so I decide to mulligan it. Throw back the Force of Will because it's not the most ideal thing to be 2-4ing yourself, especially when you're already down on cards. This hand is okay. It has lands and spells, but obviously it doesn't have any interaction for their early permanents. So this Aether Vial is going to stick around for now. Play the Baleful Strix. I draw Ending, which is really nice. It means I can kill the Vial next turn. They have the option to Vial and Mom if it's in their hand, but we do have Playing Engineers after sideboard, so I'm not as worried about that. And they have no turn to play again, so that's really good for me. I decided here to play the Uro and use it to put the land into play, get a white source, and then use that to ending the Vial. My opponent does towards the Uro, which is fantastic for me because it means that I've gotten back my card advantage and my life total is really high, so I don't have to worry about losing the game for a long time. My opponent goes Karakas into Thalia, which is a good play on their part. Drawing a second Uro is a really good feeling after this throws your first Uro. They do have a Karakas in play, so it's not the most stable thing on the board. But we do play Wasteland, so eventually we should find an answer to the Karakas. I'm not blocking with Baleful Strix, so I decided to attack. My opponent attacks with Thalia. Very straightforward. They don't have to worry about anything really with Karakas in play and me only having 2 mana up. And then they just put Urian in hand. So again, I'm thinking more lands, maybe some equipment, maybe some removal. I'm not quite sure. I felt like I wasn't ready to put Jace into play, just because they could have Sky Collaboration, things of this nature. I figured that it would be better to save that for later in the game when I had slightly more mana developed and I could play and protect it with things. And Uro being a life total buffer is nice as well. Karakas obviously is good against Uro in the sense that it keeps it off the battlefield, but against Death and Taxes specifically, just like having a thing that draws you cards and gains you life and gets you out from underneath their mana denial is really important. So I thought that just playing the Uro was the better line. They don't even use the Karakas on it, and I think that they are slightly worried about a Swords to Plowshares, which would be reasonable. It does kind of put the shields down from their point of view. And then also kind of like what I mentioned just now, where the continued advantage of Uro is really strong. So they decide to just play out their 5th mana source and use Council's Judgment on it. Which I like the line from their part. They can't keep fighting that thing forever. They do have to deal with it eventually. And this way they preserve their Karakas for their Thalia. Which is taxing me. I would like to play the Jace for 4 mana or the Dress Down for 2 mana, but I can't. Here I decided to play Jace. Part of it was that I felt that if they had a Skyclave Apparition, they would have used that to deal with the Uro instead of the Council's Judgment, because it adds to the board. So I just didn't have to worry about that card anymore. So it made me feel like Jace was, just much safer. And then also having more mana in play meant that I could potentially do more things like cast Brainstorm or cast Swords. Instead, I found Wasteland, and so I decided to do that to hit the Karakas. This line that I took right here, where I attack for 1, it's slightly worse against exactly Shadow Spear, because they have to play it for 2 mana, equip, and then kill Jace. So looking back, maybe I could have just saved the 1 point of damage, and that would have been better. I do think that was correct, actually. Just 1 point of damage isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. They get Stoneforge Mystic, however, they do decide to leave up the Karakas, which again, I think makes a lot of sense from them. Here I decide to play Baleful Strix, and then because I have the Dress Down in play, or available to me, I'm just not really worried about anything my opponent could do, really. I decided not to play out the land. I don't know if my opponent is playing Cataclysm. It's not very common at all in the Urian builds, but, Yoshitawa definitely does some less conventional things with his build sometimes, so I just wanted to have a little bit of insurance for that, just because it would be very backbreaking here. My opponent chooses not to attack. Very wise of them. I did have the Dress Down. I decided to fetch away the cards on top because they weren't good. And then this comes in with no effect. Now I have to be a little worried because my opponent has a bit of a board. But I figure I have enough removal spells in hand where I can probably use this Jace. And then I put back 2 lands. I play the Karakas and use it right away because it just makes my spells cheaper. I know the 2 lands are on top, so I mill them with the Witherbloom Command, and then I use the Prismatic Ending to deal with the Stoneforge Mystic. I know they have Cauldron Complete in hand, however, I have the swords for it, so I wasn't really worried about that. They get another Stoneforge Mystic. But again, I do just have the answers, and I don't really want to use a 2-for-1 for things that I can handle. Here I decided to swords here because Thalia is coming down, so I just want to use my mana while I can. Wasteland the Karakas, Brainstorm again. Bounce their Thalia. Back for 1. I have the Hardcast Force for the Cauldron, and that's how they decide to spend their turn. They use the Flicker Wisp. I decide that this is probably a good enough time to Gutshot the Recruiter. The 3/1 body just isn't worth a Force of Will when I have 2 Baleful Strix in play. I do decide to play the Dress down here because what they could do is they could flicker their Flicker Wisp and then they could flicker my Jace. So I decided that would let me use the Jace for the turn. Here I ponder. I think I see Uro. I shuffle it. I think I just want more removal at this point. And the Life from Loam potentially for this Raven's Crime. Which I do find. That's good. I retrace the Raven's Crime, get rid of the Cauldron, get rid of the Orion, and then I dredge back 3 lands with Loam. And then their last card in hand is Cauldron, which I have a Force Will for. So I would say that at this point the game is pretty locked up. This time, because Force Will is my only answer to Cauldron, I say, okay, you can Flicker Wisp my Jace for a turn. I don't really need it to win the game anymore. I'm super dominant here. Just gonna, keep my resources available to me. And drawing the Endurance makes me feel fine to attack with 1 Strix. I do actually have to get the game over at some point. I am only at 18 cards in library, which is not like red zone, but certainly not ideal. So here I have Endurance plus Hardcast Force. And if things get really, really dire, I can just -1 the Jace on my Endurance and then prevent myself from attacking. But at this point, I think the game is fairly straightforward to get done. I have a 3-turn clock in play. And I can even increase it by 1 turn if I fetch for a Mystic Sanctuary and get back with a Witherbloom Command. I see they're drawing Vial. Obviously, at this point in the game, Vial doesn't do anything, so I'll let them keep it. And again, we're just going through the motions at this point. I did focus on clock a little bit as well. I only have 12 minutes to finish a game 3, which is not that little, but as we can see with this game 2, the games can go rather long. So it makes sense for my opponent to make me finish them off, and because they're up by 4 minutes, it just is good good play on their part. And then they pack it in, seeing that they can't win anymore. So again, I have to mulligan to 6. This was the opening 7 got cut off by the recording a bit, but it was only Savannah was my only landed hand, and so again I have to send that back down. Mulligan to 6 again, but again this hand is pretty reasonable. I bought him the second Force of Will because it's like an insurance policy, but I don't need it right now. And again, on the multi-6, you don't really want Force of Will. I decided that because they didn't do anything turn 1, I don't mind them wastelanding me, and then I thought it was worth it to cast the Ponder to look for things. They play out of Thalia. I want to deal with this before they can untap and play a Karakas, so I decided to Gutshot it. I think that's a little bit better than the Swords. The Swords is much more versatile. I could use all my mana this turn and Swords the Spirit here. However, I know that there is a Swords of Plowshares on top of my library that I do want to draw. So I decided to untap and Swords that way. Or Swords on my turn, rather. I suppose that this line is, sweating Wasteland a tiny bit because I chose to draw the Swords rather than fetch and hope to maybe hit a land. But I thought there was some chance that they would have played Wasteland already if they had it. Pithing Needle is really, really good for me here because it's just going to get swept up by the Seeds of Innocence. So that's just an extra, card for me. And then here they hold up the Urza Saga activation, which Urza Saga is an incredibly powerful card. It might even, not be legal in Legacy for much longer, depending on what WotC decides to do. However, I will say if it has a weakness, there's a few weaknesses. One is like mass artifact removal, and the other is that it is kind of a big tempo play to spend 3 mana on turn 3 or turn 4 to make a construct, which might not be big or might get swept up. So very powerful card, but I think we see the bit of a downside there where they spent their whole turn really not putting pressure on me. 2 whole turns even, not really pressuring me because I have the answer in hand already. I don't know if they played 2 Pithing Needle. I didn't want to find out the hard way, so I just decided to fetch in response and make sure I had double green in case they drew a Wasteland. Getting Relic is pretty smart there. I have the Uro in graveyard, and they want to deal with that, and this way they draw a card as well. I was planning to block the construct with the Strix because Seeds of Innocence destroys all artifacts, including mine, so I might as well save the 2 points of damage from the construct hitting me. Luckily, my opponent just swords it, so I don't have to, and that's, again, a really good sequence of events for me. Not that it was incorrect to my opponent to do so, just that them having the Pithing Needle and swords were just like straight up card advantage for me. Here I decided to hold up Swords to Plowshares other than cast Ponder. I don't really know what I need yet with the Ponder, and it's nice to pair it with the Force of Will. They do hit their 5th mana source, but instead of something big like Batterskull, they have a Mother of Runes, and they put Urian in their hand. I could Swords it. I thought about it briefly, but then I decided that I would rather untap and see what else I draw, because if I find like Witherbloom Command or things of this nature, it's just better to use my mana that way to kill the Mother of Runes. Here, again, I'm taking a small risk where I'm keeping off this Ponder, and there's no land, but there's a Jace on top, so if my opponent does have Wasteland, I could be in trouble. Obviously, I know they don't have it. I'm just like kind of sweating a top deck. Then here comes a critical point in the game. We know they have Urian in hand, and their last card is unknown. However, Solitude is a reasonable card for them to have because, if they had any other creature that costs like 2 or 3 mana, they probably would have cast it. I have the swords in hand, but playing the Jace means that I don't have white mana right now, and I do this Brainstorm, and they very wisely cast the Solitude in response so that I can't find a blue card for this Force of Will off the Brainstorm, which means I need to find white mana. I need to find white mana with this Brainstorm. I know the top card is Prismatic Ending, so I have 2 extra looks. And let's see, do we find the white mana here? We do. We put back Plague Engineer, we put back Endurance, and we swords the Solitude. And now we have Jace on an empty board. We know their only card in hand is Urian, which doesn't pressure us particularly meaningfully. And I think that we're in the driver's seat at this point. Obviously, they could draw Recruiter of the Guard or Skyclave Apparition as a way to deal with the Jace. But barring that, I think we're in a very good spot. They draw Flicker Wisp, and they flicker their planes, I believe. Now they have the ability to make a construct with Urza Saga. Here I Brainstorm with Jace, hoping to find a land, but the Endurance I knew on top was good too. So the reason I want to find a land here is because now it lets me ending the Flicker Wisp, and then what I can do is I can cast the Plague Engineer and name Construct. And because there's no other artifacts in play, this effectively counters both Urza Saga activations. Because the first Construct is a 1/1, so it just instantly dies, and then on their next turn, because again they have no artifacts in play, the Construct would still be a 1/1, so it would also die. So here they just float their mana, get the Retrofitted Foundry, and they decide to play Urian. I have another Urza Saga as the last card. So here, I think it's still kind of a bit of back and forth. They have a board presence, but I have an active Jace. I decide that I want to cast the Brainstorm first here because if I don't find useful things, I might need to use the Jace to -1 on the Urian. I do decide to do that and leave up the Force of Will, hard cast. This attack was a small mistake because they get to make a servo and put the Jace down to 1. I was getting a little worried about my clock. You know, they're at 27 life and I only have 8 minutes. But I think that that was a small misplay. And then I also made a small misplay here where I should definitely, because I'm drawing the land next turn and I probably want to play it, I should have just put that in my hand instead of the Baleful Strix. My opponent draws Port, and then they decide to cast Orion with the idea that they're going to cast Orion and then they're also going to Port me. However, I do have the hard cast Forcible for that, so I'm not too worried. Here, I decide to get back the Seeds of Innocence with Mystic Sanctuary. It's obviously really good in this spot, getting rid of both the artifacts. And then Jace Brainstorm, put back 2 irrelevant cards, and then cast Seeds of Innocence. Destroy the Foundry, destroy the Servo. And this attack is safe, because again, Engineer is on Construct, and so it again stops their Urza Saga from making another Construct. So again, a really good sequence for me. I tap my green source, that's reasonable. Not doing anything else with the mana. So again, they have no option really but to float the mana. And they draw a Solitude. They have an answer for the Plague Engineer. Just a little bit too late on their end. You know, both the sagas are gone now. I decided to Brainstorm with Jace. Gonna play a Baleful Strix. And then here what I decided to do is decide to use the Witherbloom Command to mill my Uro straight into the graveyard and kill their Aether Violet and bring back a land. And then I have just enough mana to cast the Uro as well. So I felt that was better than playing the front half of Uro or playing Endurance. Just milling it into the graveyard is almost like an extra card off Witherbloom Command, so it's kind of like a 3-for-1 there, which is really good for a 2-mana spell. They draw Flicker Wisp, a good top deck on their end because it lets them flicker the Solitude and get rid of my Uro. So, you know, they're fighting really strongly. They're still on the board, but the Jace is just going to run away with the game slowly. They go to tap my white mana. I use the Swords Solitude. And then here, this is the point where I've locked up the game. Because I have the Raven's Crime in my graveyard still, and I can plus the Teferi. So in my opponent's draw step, I retrace the Raven's Crime, and it causes them to discard. And then because I have this Life from the Loam going, I'm never going to run out of lands, so I can just do this every turn of the game for the rest of the game. And I can use Jace to tick up and slowly win with Ultimate, or I could, you know, start attacking with my creatures as well. Here, because I know the game is locked up, I just invite the attack with the Flicker Wisp in, so that I can eat it with Endurance. And in my opponent's draw step, retrace Crime again, discard their only card. And then they attack with Flicker Wisp, and I flash an Endurance, and that prompts the concession. So that was a wild one. A lot of decisions. Like I mentioned in game 1, that play with the Jace was very questionable, very close. And it definitely ended up costing me game 1 there. But I was able to shake the dust off, play a little bit tighter in the next games. Not saying I played perfectly in these games either. Certainly fatigue was setting in a certain amount. But was able to pull out a W, and I hope showcase the power of this deck. You know, my opponent was able to throw a lot of stuff my way with, you know, triple Urza Saga, you know, Urian, Flicker Wisp, multiple Solitudes, things of this nature. But we were able to power through that. And I definitely think that highlights the strength of the deck, and I think the strength of some of the card choices, especially the black cards like Command and Plague Engineer. All right, those were the games. I hope you enjoyed. I hope that you either got to play an Eternal Weekend yourself or are enjoying consuming content from other creators who played in this event. And I hope you have a good day. I will see you all soon. Bye.